Last year, I missed 3 work deadlines in a month. My boss pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "You're not lazy, you're afraid." I was stunned and defensive, but he was right. What if what you call laziness is actually fear, low self-esteem, or even a physical health issue in disguise? Because today I'm going to share the exact framework that took me from constant procrastination to completing more tasks in a week than I used to finish in a month. No exaggeration. These aren't the usual superficial productivity tips. They target the real causes of what feels like laziness. And unlike most habits that take months to form, these create immediate results you'll feel tomorrow morning. What if I told you that laziness doesn't actually exist? I know that sounds crazy, especially when we can all point to moments where we've felt completely unmotivated, stuck in that familiar cycle of procrastination and self-judgment. 3 months ago, I missed 3 critical deadlines at work. Projects I genuinely cared about. I was convinced there was something fundamentally wrong with me, some character defect I couldn't overcome. But what I discovered through intensive research shocked me, as my brain wasn't pushing me to be lazy, it was protecting me. Neuroscience has revealed that what we label as laziness is actually your brain's protective mechanism against perceived threats. This revelation changed everything for me. We've been conditioned by society to believe that our productivity struggles stem from character flaws, that we're somehow morally deficient if we can't consistently perform at high levels. But the science tells a radically different story about what's really happening in our brains. Most people who appear lazy are actually experiencing one of 3 hidden barriers that have nothing to do with character or motivation. The first of these is fear responses. When we procrastinate or avoid tasks, it's often not because we're lazy, but because we're afraid. This fear of failure triggers our brain's protective mechanisms, causing us to avoid the very actions that might lead to growth. It's a neurological safety mechanism, not a character flaw. What's particularly fascinating is how this fear manifests physiologically. When you face tasks that trigger these fear responses, your body initiates a stress cascade, releasing cortisol, increasing heart rate, and activating your sympathetic nervous system. That afternoon slump after eating processed foods isn't laziness. It's your body responding to a lack of proper nutrients and the resulting energy crash. The third barrier has nothing to do with laziness at all: misaligned values. When we force ourselves to pursue goals that don't genuinely matter to us, we're fighting against our own internal compass. The resistance we feel isn't laziness. It's a signal that we're moving in a direction that doesn't align with our true priorities. Discovered this myself when I realized that 2 of those missed deadlines were for projects I had agreed to out of obligation rather than genuine interest. Harvard research reveals something stunning. 91% of people who struggle with procrastination are actually experiencing anxiety-based avoidance, not a lack of discipline or work ethic. This completely reframes how we should approach our productivity challenges. Instead of berating ourselves for lacking willpower, we need to address the underlying anxieties that are triggering our avoidance behaviors. Understanding these root causes allows us to implement precise interventions that work immediately rather than fighting against our biology. When I recognized that my laziness was actually fear of negative evaluation from my colleagues, I could implement specific strategies to address that fear rather than just pushing myself harder and perpetuating the cycle. The implications of this shift in understanding are profound. Think about how many hours you've spent beating yourself up for being lazy, when you might have been experiencing legitimate fear responses, energy conservation, or value misalignment. Think about how different your approach would be if you treated these issues with compassion and strategic intervention rather than self-criticism. What you call laziness is actually fear, health issues, or misaligned priorities in disguise. And once you recognize the real cause, you can apply the right solution instead of blindly pushing harder. This isn't about making excuses. It's about accurately diagnosing the problem so you can implement effective solutions. When I addressed my fears rather than my laziness, my productivity didn't just improve temporarily, it transformed completely. After transforming my productivity, I discovered something counterintuitive that elite performers rarely discuss openly. They don't actually fight their resistance. They've engineered systems that make resistance irrelevant. The most productive people aren't exercising superhuman willpower. They're triggering automatic neural pathways that bypass resistance before it even forms. This isn't about motivation or discipline, it's about neuroscience. Following my productivity crisis, I immersed myself in research on how the brain responds to resistance. What emerged was a framework I call the 5-trigger system, a neurologically-based approach that works regardless of your personality type, energy levels, or specific challenges. The beauty of this system is that it doesn't require you to become a different person. It simply works with your existing neural architecture to create immediate changes in behavior. The problem with traditional productivity advice is that it's built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the brain works. Most methods focus on boosting motivation or strengthening willpower, treating the symptoms rather than addressing the underlying mechanisms that create resistance in the first place. This creates that frustrating cycle we've all experienced: temporal motivation followed by inevitable relapse, leaving us feeling more broken than when we started. The first trigger in my framework leverages what Mel Robbins calls the 5-second rule. When you feel resistance to starting a task, count down from 5 to 1, then physically move your body before your brain has time to rationalize inaction. This works because it interrupts your default neural pathway, the automatic no that your brain generates when faced with difficult tasks. By physically moving within 5 seconds of having an impulse, you're bypassing the part of your brain that would typically talk you out of action. This isn't just pop psychology. It's based on how our brains process decisions. The countdown creates what neuroscientists call a pattern interrupt, preventing your prefrontal cortex from overthinking and activating your body before resistance calcifies into inaction. I've used this technique to start everything from workout sessions I was dreading to difficult conversations I'd been avoiding for months. The second trigger builds on implementation intentions, a powerful concept that removes decision points where resistance typically occurs. Rather than relying on motivation in the moment, you create specific when-then plans that predetermine your response to potential obstacles. MIT research shows this approach increases follow-through by an astonishing 300% because it eliminates the gap between intention and action where most productivity efforts collapse. For example, instead of saying, "I'll exercise more," you specify, "When I finish my morning coffee, then I'll immediately put on my running shoes and step outside for just 5 minutes." This precision removes the decision fatigue that triggers procrastination, creating an automatic response pattern that bypasses resistance entirely. The third trigger employs strategic environment design, perhaps the most underrated productivity hack available. Instead of fighting your brain's tendency to follow the path of least resistance, you intentionally design your environment to make productive behaviors easier and distractions harder. This means removing friction from desired actions and adding friction to undesired ones. When I struggled with morning writing, I set up my desk the night before with my laptop open to a blank document, removed social media apps from my phone, and placed my phone in another room. The environmental restructuring made writing the path of least resistance, no willpower required. And this approach works with your brain's natural energy conservation tendencies rather than fighting against them. The fourth trigger introduces minimum viable effort, starting with actions so ridiculously small that they fly completely under your brain's threat detection radar. When a task feels overwhelming, your amygdala activates a threat response, triggering resistance. By committing to just 2 minutes of writing, 5 push-ups, or reading a single page, you bypass this alarm system entirely. The counterintuitive magic of this approach is that once you start, momentum often carries you further than your initial tiny commitment. I've found that 80% of the time, those just 2 minutes of work expand into full productive sessions because starting, not continuing, is where the greatest resistance occurs. The fifth trigger combines identity-based habits with strategic accountability to create a self-perpetuating system. When you consistently apply the first four triggers, you begin to develop new neural pathways that eventually transform productivity from something you do into something you are. This identity shift is reinforced through carefully designed accountability structures that make follow-through more appealing than avoidance. We've been conditioned to believe that productivity is about force of will, about pushing harder and grinding longer. But that's fundamentally backward. What truly separates those who transform their lives from those who experience temporary motivation isn't willpower at all. It's systems. Your brain isn't designed to operate on willpower alone. It craves structure, consistency, and environmental support. When you create systems that work with your brain's architecture rather than against it, productivity becomes almost effortless. This isn't about who you are as a person. Your worth isn't measured by your output. The systems you implement either support or counteract your brain's natural inclinations. That's the only difference between consistent action and perpetual struggle. This makes productivity not just psychologically challenging, but physically impossible. Your body is literally preparing for a threat response rather than focused work. The second hidden barrier relates to your brain's extraordinary energy demands. Consider this: your brain represents just 2% of your body weight, yet consumes a staggering 20% of your energy resources. This makes energy conservation not a moral failing, but a biological imperative. When you're feeling lazy, your brain might simply be making an executive decision to conserve precious resources, especially if the task ahead seems overwhelming or unclear. This energy conservation becomes even more pronounced when we're dealing with health issues. Conditions like anxiety, depression, vitamin deficiencies, and even poor nutrition can dramatically impact your energy levels and motivation